winter fog curled around the old stone cottage at the edge of Lower Fell, a quiet parish known only for its overgrown hedgerows and a vicar with a fondness for collecting pocket watches. It was the sort of place where a dropped shilling could prompt a week of discussion, so when young Emily Carter was found dead in her aunt's sitting room, strangled with a silk scarf that reeked faintly of bitter almonds, it did not take long for the entire village to teeter on the brink of hysteria. It was not just the death that disturbed the villagers, it was how it had happened. The room had been locked from the inside, the window latched and unbroken, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and yet Emily lay on the settee, eyes wide, open, mouth frozen in a slack gasp. A red and white silk scarf wound tightly about her neck, its knot neat, deliberate. The scent of almonds, a smell that Mrs. Blythe, the postmistress, was quick to say, reminded her of marzipan, but wrong somehow, hung faintly in the air. It was Colonel Halbert who first summoned Inspector Cray from the county station. Cray was methodical, with a fondness for practical shoes and little patience for theatrics. He inspected the cottage, found no sign of a break-in, and questioned Aunt Mildred, a stern-faced woman who claimed she had been baking fruitcake at the time of death. She said Emily had returned from the post office around 3, fetched a library, book from the sitting room, and intended to go upstairs for a rest. But when she didn't come down by tea, Mildred checked on her and found the door locked. She knocked, got no answer, and eventually called for Mr. Finch, the neighbour, to force it open. That was when they discovered the body. Cray took statements, examined the scarf, and noted that it was not one Emily usually wore. Aunt Mildred said it wasn't hers either. No one recognized it. By the next morning, the entire village was aflutter. A locked room murder with an anonymous scarf and the scent of almonds. It was something out of a detective serial. Everyone had theories. Some said Emily had enemies in the city. Others whispered about her short-lived engagement to a solicitor who had disappeared abroad. Still others suggested poison, citing the almond smell as evidence, but Cray found no traces in her tea or on the cakes left untouched on the tray. It was the vicar's wife who brought Miss Marple into the matter. Miss Marple had been staying with her cousin in Much Benham and had come to Lower Fell for a short visit. The vicar's wife, sharp in a quiet way, knew that when things grew a little too tangled for plain sense, it was best to ask someone who understood people. And there were few in England better at that than Miss Marple. Miss Marple arrived at the cottage mid-afternoon, wrapped in a grey shawl and carrying a handbag that seemed to contain, among other things, embroidery needles, lavender drops and a notebook. She listened politely as Inspector Cray summarised the known facts. She asked to see the sitting room. Cray, a bit sceptical but too well-mannered to say so, obliged. The room was modest. A floral settee, a walnut bookshelf, a needlepoint cushion on the armchair, and a small tray table with a half-read mystery, novel and a cold cup of tea. The scarf, already bagged for evidence, had been removed, but Miss Marple's attention went not to what was missing, but to what remained. She picked up the teacup, sniffed gently, then asked for a list of everyone who had been inside the room in the past day. Cray frowned, but complied. It was a short list: Aunt Mildred, Mr. Finch the neighbour, the village doctor, and the inspector himself. The windows had not been opened, too cold for that. The door had been locked, and the key was still inside the room when it was forced open. So, Miss Marple murmured, "We are to assume someone managed to enter a locked room, murder a girl without leaving signs of struggle, and exit without a trace. That's the long and short of it," said Cray. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the scarf? No one has identified it? A red and white silk with a faint scent? No label? No known owner? Not hers, not the aunt's, and no fingerprint except Emily's where she tried to pull it off, if she tried. And the scent? Possibly cyanide, but no ingestion. Doctor found no poison in her system. Might have been lingering from something else, a trick of the nose even." Miss Marple stood for a moment longer, then sat gently in the armchair. She looked down at the needlepoint cushion and reached out, lifting it slightly, then setting it back down. "Tell me," she asked, "has anyone mentioned where the scarf might have come from? New? Old? Scented for a reason?" Cray blinked. "We've looked into local shops. No sales recently of anything like it. And the scarf wasn't scented, at least not deliberately." "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple. "But one must remember that things aren't always what they seem. Sometimes the simplest object, an old accessory, a gift, even something forgotten, can come back into a person's life at exactly the wrong moment." She paused, eyes scanning the room again. This was not a spontaneous murder. It was planned. Executed with precision. The locked door, the missing scarf, the almond smell, they are all clues, not complications. Cray leaned forward. "Then what do you suppose it means?" Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think it means we are looking not at how the killer got in, but rather at how the scarf got in. And more importantly, why Emily Carter never screamed." She turned toward the door. "You say the door was locked from the inside, but perhaps it wasn't locked at all until after the crime. Who had reason to make it look impossible, and who benefits from Emily's death?" As she left the room, Cray stared after her, his brow furrowed. For the first time in the investigation, he felt the chill of real unease, not because of the death itself, but because Miss Marple had begun to think aloud. And when she did that, it usually meant the truth was not far behind. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage just as the evening light dimmed across the hedgerows, the warmth of the drawing-room contrasting with the chill that had begun to seep through the village air. She did not speak of her suspicions immediately. Instead, she sat beside the fire with her knitting, her fingers looping yarn while her mind gently turned over the odd angles of the case. Across the room, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Anstruther, watched her curiously. But Miss Marple merely smiled and asked, as if discussing nothing more urgent than a lost thimble, whether anyone recalled seeing Emily Carter with new acquaintances or parcels in the past few weeks. The next morning, she returned to the cottage, not with bluster or announcement, but with the air of someone checking on an old friend. Inspector Cray was already there, poring over the scarf once more, still. Frustrated by its origin, Miss Marple asked gently whether she might speak with Aunt Mildred again. Cray agreed, though he remained doubtful that any new facts would emerge. Aunt Mildred was sitting stiffly in the kitchen, folding linen napkins with robotic precision, her mouth pressed into a tight line. She greeted Miss Marple with a nod, but no warmth. "I must apologize for the intrusion," Miss Marple said softly. "But I wonder, did you ever notice Emily carrying a particular scent? Something unfamiliar?" Aunt Mildred blinked slowly. "She had a lavender sachet in her drawer, that's all. Nothing else, I recall." "No gifts lately? Visitors who might have brought something foreign?" "She received a small parcel last week. I thought it was a book. She said it was from a friend in London." "Did you see it?" "No. It had a brown wrapper. She put it in her room." Miss Marple made a quiet noise of acknowledgement. "And the scarf? It's not yours, you're certain?" "I've never seen it before. And Emily wasn't the type for flashy silks. She liked wool and tweed. Proper things." Miss Marple thanked her and walked through to the hallway, pausing by the staircase. There were no photos of Emily around the house, which struck her as curious. Not a single framed image of the niece who had lived here for over a year. Upstairs, she requested to examine the girl's bedroom. Inspector Cray accompanied her, arms folded as if to say he was humoring her, but expecting nothing useful. Emily's bedroom was meticulously neat. Books lined one shelf, some classics, others recent mysteries. On the dressing table sat a hairbrush, a small mirror, and a bottle of inexpensive perfume. Miss Marple's gaze moved from the orderly bed to the small wastepaper basket beside the desk. She stooped slightly, retrieving a crumpled bit of brown wrapping paper with a faint grease stain and no visible writing. She held it for a long moment, then looked toward the fireplace and noticed the remains of burnt paper. She did not touch it, merely noted the edges. Part of an envelope had survived the flames, and a tiny corner still bore the purple ink of a stamp, though the address was gone. "I should like to know what prompted her to burn it," Miss Marple murmured. Cray leaned in. "Guilt, perhaps." Miss Marple did not reply. Her eyes had fixed on a narrow drawer of the writing desk. She opened it gently. Inside were receipts, a bus schedule, a dried sprig of rosemary, and a folded note written in careful cursive. "Remember, do not wear it before the 14th, and not around your aunt. She will ask questions." Miss Marple passed the note silently to Cray, who read it with growing irritation. "This could be from anyone." "But it isn't," Miss Marple said. "It's from someone who knew she lived in this house, and someone who thought Aunt Mildred would recognize the scarf." As they left the room, Miss Marple paused by the stair banister. Something had caught her eye. There was a fine scratch along the top of the banister rail, recent and distinct, as if something sharp, like a buckle or a clasp, had scraped along it. The staircase turned tightly, and a person trying to move quickly, especially in a rush, might have brushed against it. They returned to the sitting room once more. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the tea tray. She didn't drink her tea, and the cup wasn't broken, which means she sat down willingly, or with someone she trusted. Cray folded his arms. "And what of the almond smell? Still no poison in her system. Lab confirms it. I believe the scarf was scented before." "The murder," Miss Marple said. "Not intentionally, perhaps, but by proximity to something else. Something treated with cyanogenic compounds. Gloves, maybe. Or perfume. Bitter almond is such a distinct scent." Cray shook his head. "We're still short a suspect. No stranger was seen entering the house. No enemies. No inheritance to speak of. Emily was ordinary." Miss Marple's eyes turned to the bookshelf. She moved closer. "Tell me, Inspector, have you looked at these books?" "Not in depth. Mostly novels." Miss Marple ran her fingers along the spines until she found one slightly out of place. "The Silent Guest, a mystery novel." She tugged it loose. A small card fluttered to the floor. It was the calling card of a Mr. Ronald Spence, address in London, embossed in dark green. On the back, a note in the same cursive as the one in the drawer. "Tell no one until I return." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "Now, this is interesting. The book is the only one that appears to have been moved recently. And this gentleman, if he sent the scarf, why warn her to stay silent?" Cray took the card and muttered, "We'll have to speak with him, if he's still in London." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "We mustn't assume he is." As they stepped outside, Miss Marple paused on the threshold. Across the lane, Mr. Finch the neighbour was trimming his hedge. He looked up, met her eyes, and offered a stiff nod. It wasn't his expression that caught her attention, but rather the gloves he wore. Bright leather, oddly pristine for gardening. And something else, a faint shine at his collar where silk peeked out, the edge of a scarf far too fine for a countryman. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. Inside her mind the threads had begun to pull together. A scent that lingered, a parcel burned, a scarf that arrived unannounced, and a man who claimed to break down a locked door, but somehow left no bruises on the frame. There were lies in lower fell, quiet, practiced lies, but they had begun to fray. Miss Marple requested a quiet word with Mr. Finch that afternoon, just as the village clock struck 4. She found him near the hedgerow again, pretending to focus intently on the hedge shears, though the section he trimmed had already been shaped. She approached gently, greeting him with a polite remark about the lengthening days and the stubborn chill still clinging to the air. He nodded, tight-lipped, but did not quite meet her eyes. I do hope the events at the Carter house haven't disrupted your routine too severely, she said mildly, watching his hands. He shrugged. Oh, not much. Helped break the door, that's all. Poor girl. Shocking business. You must have been quite startled to see her like that. He hesitated. Yes, though I didn't see much. Mildred screamed. I looked away. Miss Marple tilted her head. Forgive me, but the door, was it truly stuck, or did it yield a little too easily? Finch's brow furrowed. I don't follow. Oh, just a passing thought. I always imagined doors forced open left more obvious marks. He blinked, and for the briefest moment something shifted in his expression. Annoyance, quickly masked. Well, it gave way all of a sudden, must have been poorly latched. Of course. Poorly latched. Her tone was neutral, almost pleasant. She watched as he fumbled with the shears, nicking a clean edge of holly for no reason at all. Back at the cottage, Inspector Cray was gathering statements, pacing the small parlour as Aunt Mildred perched in the armchair with folded hands. Miss Marple arrived just in time to hear Cray press her gently but firmly on her baking alibi. You say you were in the kitchen the entire afternoon, yet no one smelled fruitcake baking until after the body was found. I forgot to put it. In the oven, she said curtly. I had the mixture ready and only remembered it later. A strange time to forget. It was a strange day. Cray looked unconvinced, but Miss Marple stepped forward softly. And Emily's parcel, did she often receive packages from this Ronald Spence? Aunt Mildred's brow twitched. I told you, she said it was a book. I didn't ask. She received no letters, no phone calls. She rarely used the phone, didn't like it. Odd, in a girl of her age, Miss Marple murmured. But then again, perhaps not, if she felt she had to keep certain conversations secret. Cray turned to Miss Marple as they stepped into the hallway. We've tried reaching this Spence fellow. No answer yet from London. Miss Marple lowered her voice. It may not be London you'll find him in. I suspect he was here. Or near. Cray's eyes narrowed. You think he came early? Broke in? I think he was expected. Or someone was. And that Emily died because she trusted the wrong person to call. Later that day, Cray called on Mrs. Wetherill, the widow who lived 2 doors down and claimed to have heard voices from the cottage window around the time of the murder. She was eager, a bit too eager, to recount what she'd heard. I heard. Laughter. Well, not laughter exactly, more of a high voice like a giggle. And then a man's voice. Low, talking quick. I couldn't make out the words. Thought it odd, because Emily rarely had male visitors, and certainly not ones with such a, well, commanding tone. Could you identify the voice if you heard it again? She hesitated, then smiled. Possibly. I've a good ear. Played. Piano for years, Cray jotted it down. Anyone come or go from the house? No one I saw, but I wasn't watching every minute. After she shut the door, Miss Marple said quietly, she seemed almost disappointed the murder wasn't more theatrical. Cray grunted. She's inserting herself, yes. But the male voice, if it's true, adds weight to the scarf being a gift. Romantic, perhaps. Miss Marple nodded. And the scent. You know, there's a particular perfume, Laurette's Bitter Kiss. It has that almond base. Very fashionable in certain London circles. Strongly scented scarves worn for effect. A way to make a moment linger. That helps us how? I'd wager Mr. Spence, if he exists, owns such perfume. Or knows someone who does. Miss Marple returned to the cottage once more in the early evening and requested to speak with the maid, young Elsie, who came in twice a week to clean. The girl was nervous, wringing her hands in her apron. I know it's not much, she said, but last Tuesday I saw Emily in the garden speaking with Mr. Finch. It was odd, because they never said much before, and they were both standing very close. Did you hear what they were saying? Elsie shook her head. but she looked cross, and he wasn't smiling either. And then, as I was going round with the broom, I saw something in the sitting room. A silk scarf, red and white, like the one you found. But it was tucked into a book on the shelf, like someone didn't want it lying about. Did you mention it? I meant to. Then it was gone by the next day, so I thought perhaps she'd moved it. Miss Marple leaned in. You've done quite right, Elsie. And one last thing. Do you recall what book it was? Oh, yes, I remember because it had a funny name. Something about a guest. The silent guest, I think. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back down the path as the church bell struck 6. She could feel it then, the undercurrent beneath every word, the lies polished just enough to sound like truth. Aunt Mildred, with her misplaced baking and her absence of emotion. Mr. Finch, pretending to be helpful, hiding silk at his collar, and nursing some hidden anger. And now, a stranger named Spence, whose name was starting to feel like someone else's mask. They were all lying, but not equally. Some lied to protect, others to distract. Only one lied because the truth was too dangerous, and Miss Marple intended to know which one by morning. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, long before the vicarage stirred. The previous day's interviews had left her with a sense of coiled tension. Too many stories, each neat on its own but discordant when laid side by side. She wrapped her shawl tightly about her shoulders and walked quietly to the Carter cottage, arriving just as the mist began to lift from the grass. Aunt Mildred answered the door with a wary look, her eyes still rimmed with sleeplessness. I won't be long, Miss Marple said gently. I'd like to ask about Emily's finances. Did she have any accounts, savings, insurance perhaps? Aunt Mildred blinked. She had a post office account, barely touched it. She didn't earn much. Her job in the city ended last month. And you were supporting her? She paid rent. Not much. I don't need handouts. Miss Marple nodded. Was there any mention of new employment? A change of plans? She said she had an offer from London. I thought it was talk. What kind of work? She wouldn't say, but I didn't like the sound of it. She was spending more time on the telephone recently, always going to the post office, sending letters. Cray arrived not long after, coat flapping and brow furrowed. We reached Mr. Spence, he said. He's real, a journalist. Claims he met Emily twice in London, thought she had a story about something, wouldn't say what, but now denies sending anything to her. No scarf, no note. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. So someone used his name to gain her trust. Appears that way. He's coming tomorrow to make a statement. Miss Marple turned to Aunt Mildred. You mentioned you thought her plans were unwise. Did she ever say what she was afraid of? Afraid? Mildred's mouth tightened. She wasn't afraid. She was reckless, left things lying about, talking to men who had no business calling on her. Like Mr. Finch? A shadow flickered across her face. He's always been around. I didn't say anything happened. But you suspected something. Mildred hesitated. He asked after her often, gave her rides into town. She never mentioned him, but I noticed. He tried too hard to look harmless. Outside, Miss Marple and Cray walked the path in silence for a moment. She's hiding something, Cray said. But whether it's her own guilt or someone else's, I can't yet tell. They all are, Miss Marple replied softly, but in different ways. Mildred's pride makes her conceal more than she should. Finch, he's evasive, trying to insert himself, then vanish. Cray exhaled. There's no straightforward motive, no robbery, no affair, no inheritance. That's where you're wrong, Miss Marple said. There's always a motive. It simply may not be the kind that leaves fingerprints. Later that afternoon, they called Finch in for a formal statement at the station. He sat stiffly, hands folded over one another, and when asked again about the scarf, he shook his head. I never saw it until that day. I told you I only helped break in the door. Cray leaned forward. And yet the maid saw you in the garden with her, and the scarf tucked into a book before the murder. Finch didn't blink. Emily was kind to everyone. If I offered her something, it was just a gift. I didn't kill her. But she never wore it. Then she didn't want to. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Did she reject you, Mr. Finch? He looked at her sharply. That's a ridiculous question. She was young, independent. You may have mistaken politeness for affection. It happens. He stood. Are we finished? For now, Cray said. But as Finch left, Miss Marple caught the faintest smudge of something pale on the cuff of his jacket. Powder, perhaps, or flour. Not quite the sort of dust that clings to hedgerows. Back at the Carter house, Miss Marple requested one more visit to Emily's room. Alone. She stood by the desk, looking at the small photograph she hadn't noticed before, wedged inside a book of poetry, nearly hidden. It showed Emily and another young woman, arms linked, smiling. On the back, E and C. Not a secret forever. She took the photo to the vicarage and quietly made a call to a friend in London, an old pupil now working in the telephone exchange, to ask if a number could be traced, one Emily had called regularly in the weeks before her death. When she returned, Cray was waiting with news. The lab re-examined the scarf. There was cyanide, very faint, not in the fabric, but on the knot. Someone had handled it with residue on their hands. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So the almonds weren't a clue. They were an accident. From what? Bitter almond oil is sometimes used in certain cleaning agents, also pesticides. But more likely, she trailed off, her mind flicking, back to the powder on Finch's cuff. Poisons used for rodent control, common in old sheds. Finch keeps one, doesn't he? He does. We can search it. Do. And ask him whether he's missing any gloves. The next morning brought Mr. Spence by train, a tall man with a weary face and an honest manner. He confirmed that Emily had approached him with a potential story about small-town secrets and a man with connections to a scandal. She'd mentioned names, but not his. Only said she feared causing harm. She said she'd send proof, Spence added. She never did. I assumed she'd backed out. Did you give her any token? A scarf, perhaps? Never. Miss Marple listened in silence. Then, as Spence was leaving, she asked gently, did she ever speak of a companion? Another woman? Someone close to her? He hesitated. Yes. A friend. She said they were close, but that things had gone sour. I assumed it was romantic. Miss Marple walked to the churchyard after he left, her steps slow, deliberate. She stared at the stone benches near the lich gate where Emily had sometimes read in the afternoons. There she imagined the girl, torn between revealing a secret and protecting someone, a relationship, perhaps with a woman, a scandal in a village like this, a rejection that turned bitter. The web was tightening. Mildred, ashamed. Finch, spurned. A scarf given in affection turned into a symbol of betrayal, a message in the form of silence, and at its center, a girl who trusted the wrong person to hold her secrets. The truth was nearly ready to be spoken. It only needed one more thread to pull it all taut. The following afternoon brought a ripple of energy through Lower Fell when Inspector Cray returned from Finch's shed, bearing what he considered a decisive breakthrough. Wrapped in brown paper, carefully tagged and sealed, were a pair of worn leather gloves and a glass bottle marked with a faded label, pesticide, the agricultural sort common in older storage sheds. One glove had a pale residue inside the fingers. The other bore a faint reddish smudge like dye. More compelling still, tucked under a stack of newspapers in the corner, was a scrap of red silk, just a torn edge, but identical in weave and pattern, to the scarf found around Emily's neck. Cray's voice rang with satisfaction as he laid it all out in front of Miss Marple in the station's cramped sitting room. That's enough to place the scarf in Finch's possession before the murder. Combine it with the gloves, likely the source of the cyanide residue, and the man's inconsistent statements, and we've got motive, means, and opportunity. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, fingers laced, her expression unreadable. Have you confronted him? Just now. He denies everything, of course. Says the gloves are his, yes, but he hasn't used that pesticide in years. Claims the silk must have come from something Emily left behind. And do you believe him? Cray hesitated, only briefly. I think he's lying. He was far too calm when I told him about the scarf fragment, like he expected it. Miss Marple nodded slowly, but her gaze drifted to the bottle of pesticide on the table. The label was worn, the cap loose. And yet, she said softly, you said yesterday the cyanide was only on the knot of the scarf. Yes, not the whole fabric, just the knot. Curious, isn't it? A man who planned a murder with poison, wearing gloves, placing a scarf around a girl's neck, but he forgets and handles the knot barehanded. Cray frowned. He might have slipped up. Perhaps. But the knot is the most intimate part of the act, the closest, the most personal. To strangle someone, face to face, knowing they trusted you. She trailed off, then looked up. He didn't love her. Cray's brows lifted. You think love was involved? I think obsession was involved. Or shame. Someone whose anger came from betrayal, not rejection. Outside, the air had turned, brisk again. The villagers began whispering that the case was nearly closed, that Mr. Finch would likely be charged. A wave of strange relief passed through the village. Something terrible had happened, but it had been caught, pinned, explained. Miss Marple, however, remained unsettled. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hedgerows, she visited the Carter cottage one final time. Aunt Mildred answered the door looking triumphant, her posture stiff with vindication. I assume you've come to see justice done, she said with a tight smile. I came to return this, Miss Marple replied, handing her the photograph of Emily and the unknown girl. It was in Emily's room. Mildred's face changed, just slightly, but it was enough. Her hand trembled as she reached out for it. She was young, Miss Marple said softly, and she trusted people who didn't know how to accept that. Trust. Mildred's fingers clutched the photo, her voice hard. I don't know who that girl is. You know, Miss Marple said gently. I believe you do. There was a long pause, the kind that settles over a room like dust. She was ruining herself, Mildred said finally. Writing things, talking to strangers, making our name into gossip. I tried to guide her, but she turned away from everything decent. Miss Marple did not respond. She only watched. I didn't kill her, Mildred added quickly. I believe you didn't mean to, Miss Marple said, but Cray remained fixed on Finch. The evidence was too convenient, too solid. By morning, the papers in the nearby town had printed the story. Village shaken by tragedy, suspect in custody. Finch was held pending charges, his solicitor summoned from Cheltenham. He maintained his innocence, but the tide had turned. The scarf, the gloves, the shed, none of it could be waved away now. Still, something gnawed at Miss Marple. That afternoon, she visited the churchyard again, pausing at the bench where Emily used to sit. It was there that she found something odd. A small brooch, a silver leaf with a single red bead. Nestled beneath the bench, half buried. She picked it up carefully. It was warm from the sun, but the clasp was bent, as though torn away. She returned to Emily's bedroom and checked the small wooden box on the dresser, an old trinket case lined in velvet. Inside were earrings, a few rings, and a gap where something should have been. Miss Marple opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the same mystery novel where the scarf had once been hidden. A second item lay wedged behind it now, a folded letter unsent, addressed to C. The contents were short, pained. Emily had planned to leave the village. She wanted to escape the shame and cold stares. She had told C to meet her the evening before her death, to take her away. But C never came. Miss Marple pressed the letter to her chest. The false ending had been declared too soon. Finch, it turned out, had been a red herring, angry, yes, and strange, but not a murderer. His pride was wounded, his feelings twisted, but he had never been inside that locked room. The scrap of scarf had been planted. And the gloves, someone else had handled them. The brooch in Miss Marple's palm gleamed faintly as she stepped outside. Across the path, Mrs. Wetherill was hanging laundry. She looked up and smiled, a little too brightly. "Out enjoying the air," she called. Miss Marple smiled back. "Just stretching my legs. Lovely afternoon." "Yes, lovely indeed. And such a relief, isn't it, to have all this nonsense settled?" Miss Marple's eyes moved to the woman's blouse, an old practical garment pinned at the collar with a different brooch now. A cheap brass oval, not the one found under the bench. It was a small thing. But in Miss Marple's world, small, things were never just that. As she turned back toward the vicarage, the weight of that brooch in her hand settled something within her. The final act had not yet begun, but the curtain had only been drawn halfway. And behind it, someone still waited, quiet, patient, and unexposed. The next morning, Miss Marple sat quietly at the vicarage, the brooch resting on a folded handkerchief beside her teacup. She hadn't shown it to Cray yet. There was something about the object, something personal and strangely intimate, that made her hesitate. She studied it again, the bent clasp, the red bead gleaming like a drop of warning, and thought of the young woman in the photograph with Emily, the one marked only as C. That friendship, or perhaps something deeper, had been treated as a threat by more than one person in this village. And someone, she now suspected, had acted on that threat with cool resolve. By mid-morning, a telegram arrived from her contact in London, confirming what she already suspected. The number Emily had called so often in her final weeks was registered to a Miss Clara Wetherill. Not Mrs. Wetherill, the laundry-hanging gossip, but her daughter, who had left Lower Fell some years ago under something of a cloud. It had been spoken of at the time as a family matter, not discussed in polite company. Clara had been barely 20 when she left, and no one in the village had mentioned her name since. Miss Marple rose at once and made her way down to the vicarage garden where Mrs. Anstruther was trimming rose bushes. She asked in an offhand manner if she remembered Clara Wetherill. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Anstruther said, frowning slightly. "Bright girl, a bit spirited. Left suddenly. Her mother said she went to work in London, but I always thought there was more to it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Do you recall who she spent time with before she left?" The vicar's wife's frown deepened. "Emily's father, Henry Carter, before his accident. They were seen together quite a bit. It caused talk. That name, it had hardly come up since Emily's death. Everyone spoke of her as if she had appeared out of nowhere, as if her past had no bearing on her end. But Henry Carter, Emily's father, had died in a fire a decade ago, a fire started by an overturned lamp in the barn behind his property. Officially, an accident. But Miss Marple remembered that fire. She had read about it in a brief article years ago. The circumstances were vague. The body burned beyond recognition. The widow, Mildred, had identified the remains based on a ring and watch. No autopsy was conducted. Too little left to examine, the paper said. Closed quickly, with little fuss. Miss Marple walked to the church records office where the vicar allowed her to browse the parish archives. She asked to see the Carter file, births, deaths, property records. A few yellowed papers turned up. Something curious. Henry Carter had recently updated his will the month before his death, cutting off a distant cousin in favor of an unnamed dependent. That section of the will had been struck through but not legally amended. No further beneficiaries were listed after his death. Miss Marple closed the file gently, her mind now tracing a new, more troubling path. She returned to the police station, requesting a quiet word with Cray. He was poring over a fresh report confirming the trace of cyanide on the gloves matched the type found in Finch's shed. Still, his expression was uneasy. "It all fits," he said, "but too easily. The scarf fragment, the gloves. It feels like someone knew exactly what we'd look for." "Because they did," Miss Marple said calmly. "They planted it, Inspector. And I believe I know who." She laid the brooch on his desk. Cray stared. "What's this?" "Found beneath the churchyard bench. It matches the gap in Emily's jewellery box, likely torn off during a scuffle or in haste. But what matters isn't the brooch. It's the woman who used to wear it." She told him what she'd learned. Clara Wetherill, daughter of the helpful widow, had known Emily's father and, it now seemed, Emily, more than known her. The letters suggested a deep attachment, and Clara had a reason to despise the Carter family. Henry Carter's abrupt death had spared him a scandal, an unacknowledged child perhaps, a broken promise. Then Emily returned to the village years later, unaware of the full past, and reconnected with someone who remembered her father well. The past began to surface, and someone, somewhere, became very afraid of what would be exposed. Cray sat back, in his chair, brow furrowed. So Clara came back, met Emily in secret, maybe rekindled something. Emily trusted her. Then what? Then Clara confided in her mother, Miss Marple said, who saw in Emily not just a threat but a painful reminder, a child born of betrayal, a girl who stirred old wounds in her daughter. Maybe Clara had second thoughts. Maybe she wanted to leave with Emily, as the letter said. But Mrs. Wetherill wouldn't allow that. Not again. Cray shook his head slowly. "You're saying Mrs. Wetherill killed her?" "She's the only one who knew enough to mislead us at every step. She reported voices, when there were none. Claimed to hear a male visitor, when Clara was the one visiting. She created confusion, directed suspicion, helped anchor the timeline. Then once she saw Finch being questioned, she quietly planted evidence in his shed. The gloves, the scarf scrap. Easy enough for someone who knows the rhythms of the village, who knows when a man goes out and leaves his shed unlocked." Cray looked back at the brooch. "And she didn't mention her daughter once." "Because Clara's existence undermines everything. If the village remembers her, they remember the past, and that past is the key." That evening, they visited the Wetherill home together. Mrs. Wetherill greeted them with her usual crisp politeness, though her smile faltered when she saw the brooch in Cray's hand. She said nothing at first, only stared at it, her mouth parting. "Slightly." "Yours?" Cray asked. "No. It matches the one missing from Emily's room," Miss Marple said. "And it was found where you said you saw a stranger the night Emily died." "I don't know how it got there," Cray nodded. "Tell me, when was the last time you saw Clara?" There was a pause, the kind that stretches until it breaks. Mrs. Wetherill's voice dropped, brittle and thin. "She came home, briefly. A few weeks ago. I didn't want her staying. She upset everything, stirred things that had no place here anymore." "Did you know she was seeing Emily?" Her silence was answer enough. Miss Marple stepped forward. "You thought Emily would take her away again. You saw your daughter finally coming back to you and then slipping through your fingers. So you did what you thought would protect her." Tears welled, not of sorrow but of fury. "She was ruining Clara again, feeding her dreams, filling her head with poison. I just wanted it to stop." Cray placed a hand on the back of the chair. "We'll need you to come with us." Mrs. Wetherill didn't resist. She stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the brooch. She wouldn't let go, she whispered. Neither of them would. As she was led away, Miss Marple remained behind, standing quietly in the Wetherill kitchen, listening to the clock tick. Shadows from the past had drifted into the present, and the weight of long-buried secrets had finally collapsed. Emily had died not because she loved unwisely, but because someone feared what love might reveal. The morning after Mrs. Wetherill was taken into custody, Lower Fell moved with the cautious stillness of a village unsure if the storm had truly passed. The news had not yet spread widely. Inspector Cray was careful with such matters, but there was a change in the air, like a room where someone had just confessed to a long-hidden truth. Still, something tugged at Miss Marple. Though Mrs. Wetherill had admitted enough to warrant suspicion, the final thread of intention, who had planned, who had acted, and who had simply been used, remained tangled. Clara Wetherill had yet to appear, and no one, not even Cray, could say precisely where she had gone. Miss Marple returned to the Carter cottage that day not to speak with Aunt Mildred or inspect the room again, but to sit quietly in the garden, where Emily had often walked. The daffodils were just starting to bloom, and she imagined the girl tracing the narrow stone path, letters in her pocket, hope carried like a folded promise. The scent of the garden reminded her of something, an association flickering at the edge of memory, but she couldn't catch it. Not yet. Inside the sitting room, Cray was sorting through the final reports. "We're sending a team to Clara's last known address in London," he said. "But the mother won't say a word about where she's gone, not even now." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Sometimes silence is the last thing a mother gives her child. Cray sighed. "Still, if she helped, she's complicit. The scarf, the poison, there are fingerprints somewhere." "Perhaps. But it's not fingerprints we're missing, Inspector. It's character." Cray frowned. "Meaning?" "I believe Emily trusted Clara enough to keep quiet about the past, but someone used that trust, twisted it. Clara may not be the killer, and Mrs. Wetherill may not be the only one lying." Cray straightened. "Then how do we find out who really pulled the knot tight?" Miss Marple tapped a finger to her chin. "We need to unsettle them, not with accusations, with the unexpected." Later, that afternoon, she returned to the vicarage and requested a favour from the vicar's wife: access to the church's old memorial ledger. She flipped through its pages with slow precision, searching for something specific. At last she found it. An entry from nearly a decade earlier, a small footnote beside Henry Carter's name. "Donation received from Wetherill family following fire damage, pew restoration." That donation wasn't odd in itself, but it proved presence. Mrs. Wetherill had been at the scene long before she ever admitted. She hadn't just known Henry Carter, she had mourned him publicly, which meant she had also seen the girl he left behind. She knew from the beginning what Emily represented. With this in mind, Miss Marple invited Aunt Mildred to tea. The woman arrived as stiff as ever, spine rigid, lips pursed, her gloves barely off before she began sniffing the edges of the room. But Miss Marple did not press. She spoke kindly of small things, of the vicar's roses and the latest train timetables, until the woman relaxed just enough to reveal a sliver of thought behind the propriety. "You've heard Mrs. Wetherill's been arrested," Mildred said eventually, with a note that wasn't quite satisfaction and not quite relief. "Terrible shame." "Terrible indeed," Miss Marple replied. "A mother's love turning so sharp." "She never approved of Emily," Mildred said. "Not really, always acted too familiar." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. Then, casually, she reached into her handbag and placed a folded page on the table. It was a letter, Emily's, addressed to Clara, but redrafted in Miss Marple's own hand, a reconstruction. Nothing in it directly accused anyone, but the tone was unmistakable. Disappointment, betrayal, fear. It ended with a line that wasn't. In the original, "If anything happens to me, it won't be a stranger's doing." Mildred's eyes scanned the letter, and her hand paused mid-air, holding the cup just shy of her lips. She was afraid, Miss Marple said softly. Afraid someone close to her would silence her. That's why she burned the parcel. That's why she hid the scarf in the book. Mildred set her cup down without drinking. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter. But I do wonder if the wrong person were blamed. Would the real killer feel relief or fear?" Mildred looked up then, and for a moment her eyes were hollow. Then she smiled, too quickly. "You're playing tricks, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, calmly. But then again, so did someone else. Someone who sent a parcel scented with cyanide. Someone who placed a scarf that wasn't theirs in a girl's hands and told her not to wear it near her aunt. Mildred stood. "I think I'll be going." Miss Marple did not stop her, only watched. The test had worked, not as a trap of logic, but as a trap of emotion. Mildred had never feared Mr. Finch. She had never truly believed in the guilt of Mrs. Wetherell either. Her worry now was not about justice, but exposure. That evening, Miss Marple spoke again with Cray. "It's time we brought Aunt Mildred in. She's not the sort to strangle a girl in fury. But in cold disapproval, yes, especially if she saw her niece as a stain on the family. But she has no clear motive. She has pride and fear." Emily was going to leave, perhaps with Clara, perhaps to tell the village the truth about her father, about how Mildred kept that child's name buried. And that was a truth she couldn't allow to surface. Not again. Cray hesitated. "You think she staged the whole thing? Even the scarf?" "I believe she intercepted the parcel meant for Clara, used it to frame another. Emily never knew it was her aunt's hand tightening the noose." The next morning, they approached the Carter home together. Mildred answered with her usual composure, but it cracked the moment Miss Marple offered her the brooch again. She held it for a heartbeat too long, then let it drop. She was going to destroy everything, she whispered. Just like her father did. One generation wasn't enough. Cray said nothing, only reached for his notebook. Mildred stared at the floor. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I only meant to frighten her. The scarf was meant to remind her, a warning, but then she laughed, said she was leaving, said I couldn't stop her." Miss Marple, quietly, "And you couldn't let her go?" "She would have taken the name with her. Our name." Outside, the wind stirred the trees. The final mask had slipped, not with force, but with something more telling, guilt worn like pearls around the neck polished by silence. Miss Marple turned away from the house, her steps light. There was no satisfaction in it, only the certainty that what had been concealed in bitterness had finally surfaced. The truth, as always, had waited patiently for its moment to speak. The confession, once spoken, left the air thick and silent. Aunt Mildred did not weep, did not plead. She merely stood by the windowsill as Inspector Cray noted down her words, each one etched into the official record with the gravity of finality. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, not triumphant, but solemn. Justice, she knew, was rarely clean. It left behind bruises, especially in quiet places like Lower Fell, where reputation was stitched more tightly than blood. Cray arranged for Mildred's formal statement to be recorded that evening, and with the cooperation of the magistrate, a temporary holding order was placed until Clara Wetherell could be located. Though the elder Wetherell remained in custody, Cray made it clear the matter was far from over. Clara's absence left too many questions hanging in the cold air, and the public story, What the village would be allowed to know had yet to be decided. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage with a weight in her chest she could not easily shake. There was something unfinished still, something missing. She felt it in the way Mildred's final words had trailed off, not with remorse but calculation. It had not been the admission of a woman collapsing under guilt, but of someone choosing their terms, controlling the shape of the truth even as it slipped from her grasp. The next morning, Cray arrived, looking pale and irritated. Miss Marple was already in the parlour with her tea when he stepped in, holding a damp envelope in one hand. "It's gone," he said, without preamble. "The letter, the original one you found behind the book, Emily's note to Clara, vanished from the file." Miss Marple's hands paused mid-air. "But it was submitted to the evidence room." "I checked myself," Cray said grimly. "Initialed it, but sometime between last night and this morning, the drawer was unlocked and the envelope removed. No signs of forced entry, no record of access, just gone." She sat back slowly, letting the full weight of the development settle. The letter had been one of the only pieces connecting Clara to the deeper narrative, the only thing Emily had left behind that could prove she was afraid, that her intentions had been misunderstood, perhaps even twisted. Without it, Clara's role in the story could be erased, or worse, rewritten. "Someone is trying to end this on their own terms," Miss Marple said softly. Cray nodded. "And it had to be someone inside the station. No one else had access, which narrows things unpleasantly." "Perhaps," she murmured, "but if we focus only on access, we may miss something more dangerous." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the Carter cottage alone. The police seal had been removed now that Mildred was in custody, and the house stood quiet, unoccupied, its interior still dressed in the routines of a life interrupted. She moved through the rooms with care, pausing at the desk where Emily had once sat, then at the bookshelf where the scarf had been hidden. Everything had been picked clean by now, but Miss Marple was not looking for obvious things. Instead, she opened the bottom drawer of the side table beside the settee. Beneath a stack of old newspapers and sewing patterns was a narrow tin box, the sort used for loose buttons or coins. Inside it were stamps, ticket stubs, and a folded note, torn from a larger sheet. It read only, "Don't forget, books leave traces too." It wasn't Emily's handwriting, nor Mildred's. It was firm, almost mechanical, like someone unused to writing by hand. Miss Marple held it to the light, turning it slowly. The message was cryptic on the surface, but not if one recalled where Emily had hidden the scarf, inside a novel, and where the false letter had been kept, also in a book. It was as if someone else knew her habit. The discovery gave her pause. If someone understood Emily's methods well enough to leave a note, they might also have known where to look for the real letter and when to strike. That evening, she asked to speak privately with Elsie, the part-time maid. The girl arrived at the vicarage nervously, cap in hand, eyes darting. "You've been very helpful, Elsie," Miss Marple said kindly. "I'm just wondering, when you last cleaned the parlour, did you notice anything missing from the side table?" I don't know. There was always papers. I didn't touch them. But someone else might have." The girl hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Sometimes Mr. Finch would come in after I left. Said he had things to discuss with Miss Carter, but I never saw them talk much." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And did he ever seem to read while he waited?" "He'd take a book from the shelf. Once I saw him put one back. Not the same one he took, I think. That small crack let the rest fall into place." Mr. Finch had known the house well. He was the first to find the body with Mildred. He was overlooked after the scarf evidence pointed away from him. But what if, sensing the investigation, shifting again, he had slipped into the station, removed the letter, and once again vanished into the background? Cray was unconvinced at first. He's barely mentioned these last few days. No motive left. People like Mr. Finch don't need fresh motives, Miss Marple replied. They cling to old ones. He saw Emily as a disruption, a girl who turned down his kindness, who stirred up feelings he never dared act upon. She belonged to the past. He couldn't accept, and he feared being exposed for how close he truly was. That evening, Cray called Finch in under the pretense of final paperwork. The man arrived as neatly dressed as ever, calm, even affable. But when shown the torn note from the tin box, his demeanor changed. A twitch in the jaw, the briefest glance, downward. And when Cray asked whether he'd ever removed anything from the evidence room, Finch said too quickly, "No need. I'm not involved anymore, am I?" It was enough. Later that night, while Cray secured an official search order, Miss Marple returned to the Carter house and opened the very novel where the scarf had first been hidden, The Silent Guest. This time, wedged at the very back, behind, the inner binding, was a second envelope, hand-addressed to Clara, never posted. Emily had written 2 letters. The one in the drawer was never meant to be found. It was bait. She had left the real one where only someone who knew her intimately would think to look again. Inside was a final line. "I believe someone here wants me gone. If they succeed, please don't let them tell my story for me." Miss Marple closed the book gently. Emily had been afraid, but not silent. She had left her truth tucked in the one place she trusted. Paper, pressed between words, waiting for someone to turn the last page. The discovery of the second letter altered the tone of the entire investigation. Inspector Cray read it twice in silence, his jaw tight as he traced the signature at the bottom. Emily Carter's hand, delicate but resolute. It was the proof they needed, not just of her fear, but of her attempt to preserve something true in a world determined to silence her. The letter would now anchor the case, not as an accessory, but as a voice that refused to vanish. Cray arranged for it to be copied and sealed with armed supervision. Finch, meanwhile, remained under watch, though he denied any involvement in removing the previous letter and insisted he had no knowledge of the second. Miss Marple, however, had begun to notice something odd in the rhythm of the village. People were growing quiet again. Not with grief this time, but with a sense of being watched. A few doors stayed bolted in daylight. Conversations halted when she walked by. It wasn't fear of the past anymore. It was fear of the present. And it began, she believed, with Clara Wetherill. Clara had not surfaced. Her old address in London was empty. The landlady claimed she'd moved out abruptly 2 weeks before Emily's death, leaving no forwarding information. A trace was placed through police channels, but with limited resources, and no confirmed crime against her. The search was slow. Too slow. And as Miss Marple sat alone that evening with the letter laid out before her, she realized something she hadn't before. The envelope was sealed, unopened. Clara had never read it. Emily's last truth, the one meant for Clara, had never reached her, which meant she never knew she had been betrayed, or by whom. Which meant she might still be seeking answers, possibly even revenge. That night, the vicar's wife burst into the parlour, pale and breathless. "There's been a break-in at the station." Miss Marple was already on her feet. They arrived to find the building dim and chaotic. A rear window had been forced open. The evidence cabinet had been pried apart. 2 files missing, 1 drawer half burnt, and worst of all, Inspector Cray was gone. The desk sergeant had seen him last at 9. He'd been working late, reading through the timeline. No one had heard a struggle, no blood, just a coat left on the chair and a trail of muddy footprints leading out the back. Only one set in haste, and then silence. Miss Marple stood in the station doorway, her hand to her chest. The wind cut sharp across the courtyard, but it wasn't the cold that made her tremble. It was the clarity now forming. Someone still believed they could erase what had happened. Someone desperate enough to reach into the very heart of the investigation and tear it apart from within. She turned to the constable. Search every abandoned building within a mile. Start with Finch's shed, then check the Wetherill property. The search began before dawn. They found nothing at the shed, and the Wetherill home showed no signs of disturbance. But in the woods beyond the old mill, long, disused and overgrown, a lantern flickered faintly behind a boarded-up window. Cray was found inside, hands tied, bruised but conscious, seated against the stone wall of what had once been the mill's inner chamber. He'd been struck from behind, dragged, and left with a warning pinned to his chest. Stop digging. Miss Marple arrived not long after he was freed. Cray, groggy but lucid, managed a weak smile. They didn't want to kill me, just to scare me off. She nodded. But they've made a mistake. You saw something, didn't you? Cray frowned. Yes, just before it happened. I was reading through the old property records. Mildred's house, it wasn't hers originally, it belonged to the Wetherills, gifted decades ago. The two families were tied through land and money, but something went wrong after Henry Carter married Mildred. There was a dispute. Not just over property, Miss Marple said. Over Clara. Cray's brow furrowed. Clara again. She was Henry's responsibility, perhaps even his daughter. And when he chose Mildred, the past had to be erased, including the child, so Clara was sent away. Then Henry died. Mildred claimed everything, and the only one left to contest it disappeared. Cray nodded slowly. So Clara returns. She finds Emily. They connect. But then Emily dies. Because Mildred was not the only one with something to protect. Miss Marple said, that afternoon Clara was finally found, by accident. A patrol officer spotted a woman sheltering inside a collapsed boathouse near the river. She was soaked, pale, trembling, and armed with a small knife. She surrendered it without resistance. At the station, she refused to speak for nearly an hour. Then Miss Marple entered the room and laid the unopened letter in front of her. Clara's face broke open, not with tears, but with something quieter. Recognition, the kind that closes a wound too long ignored. She reached for the envelope and stared at the seal, her fingers trembling. I thought she hated me, Clara said softly. I thought she blamed me for everything that happened. She trusted you, Miss Marple replied. Even when she was afraid. I didn't kill her. Her voice cracked. I was supposed to meet her that night. She never came. No, Miss Marple said, because someone made sure she couldn't. Clara's eyes darkened. I knew someone was watching us. Emily told me she'd seen movement in the garden, a figure near the shed. I told her not to go back, but she said she had to get her father's papers, proof that what Mildred claimed wasn't true. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And that's when they acted. Clara looked up sharply. It wasn't her aunt. No, Miss Marple said. Not directly. It was someone else. Someone used to watching, waiting, and stepping in at just the right moment to protect their version of the past. That night, with the station under tighter guard and Cray recovering under supervision, Miss Marple walked once more to the Carter house. This time she didn't search. She waited, and just past midnight, the front gate creaked. Mr. Finch. He moved like someone checking for ghosts. Quiet, measured, practiced. He carried nothing, but his eyes scanned the windows. Miss Marple stepped into view before he reached the porch. You've been cleaning up after them, she said quietly. First the scarf, then the shed, then the letter. And now? He froze. I only ever tried to do what was right. But the truth is inconvenient. Isn't it? It muddles legacy, changes how people remember the Carters, or the Wetherells, or you. He took one step back. You don't understand. I do, she said. You didn't kill her, but you helped cover it. Out of loyalty, or love, or fear. He looked down at his hands, and for the first time, his voice dropped to a whisper. She said I owed her, that we were all better off if Emily was just forgotten. She was wrong. Yes, he said, barely audible, but by then it was too late. Miss Marple said nothing. The night air did the rest, and for the first time in many days it felt like the shadows in Lower Fell were beginning to thin. The early hours passed without incident. Mr. Finch had not resisted. He had not fled. Instead, he had stood beneath. The brittle moonlight, as if the weight of silence long held, had finally outlived its usefulness. Inspector Cray was informed immediately, and despite his injuries, insisted on conducting the follow-up himself. Finch's statement was vague, neither full confession nor denial. He acknowledged knowledge of the crime, hinted at pressure from someone he never named, and admitted to disposing of the first letter. But still there was hesitation in him, as though a final piece of guilt lay just beyond his reach, or perhaps beyond his willingness to speak aloud. Clara Wetherill, after reading Emily's real letter, had retreated into quiet. She answered questions plainly, but her gaze remained fixed somewhere else, far away, as if speaking to ghosts only she could see. Cray, though cautious, no longer suspected her of direct involvement. Miss Marple believed she was telling the truth. Clara had not acted out of rage, but out of love clouded by fear. Someone else, someone closer to the Carter household, had been the deciding hand. By mid-morning, Miss Marple returned to the cottage for what she intended to be the last time. The rooms had been tidied by police, but the stale scent of faded perfume still clung faintly in the bedroom, and a layer of dust had begun to settle across the hearth where Emily once read late into the evening. Miss Marple did not open drawers or search for lost papers. Instead, she stood still in the middle of the parlour, turning slowly in place, letting her memory drift. Something had bothered her, something about Finch's visit the night before. His words had been guarded, yes, but one sentence lingered. She said I owed her. Miss Marple had assumed at first that he meant Mildred, but now she wasn't certain. The phrase had been spoken with too much hesitation, too much weight. She walked over to the bookcase and ran her finger along the spines, pausing at the novel where the scarf had first been hidden, The Silent Guest. The same book that held Emily's warning. She removed it, flipped through it again, but nothing remained inside. Then, almost idly, she looked at the shelf just below. On it sat a row of gardening manuals, thin, forgettable, most long out of print. But one of them, Roses of the English. Country Garden had a faded cover, yet its spine bore no dust. She pulled it free. Inside the front cover was a name, written in a precise but unfamiliar hand. H.C.W. Henry Carter Wetherill. Her breath caught. Wetherill. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly. About halfway through, pressed between chapters on pruning and grafting, was a single photograph, slightly yellowed but unmistakably real. It was a wedding photo. Henry Carter stood in the centre, holding hands not with Mildred, but with a younger woman, smiling shyly. Clara Wetherill's mother. And on the back, a single word, unfiled. She sat down, the book resting on her lap. The pattern was there now, uncoiling clearly. Clara had not been Henry's secret lover's child. She had been his legitimate daughter. Which meant Emily and Clara were half-sisters. Which meant Emily's inheritance claim would not only have reshaped Mildred's standing in the village, but would have split the Carter estate cleanly in two. It had never been about shame. It had always been about ownership. Miss Marple returned to the station at once, the book in hand. Cray read the inscription and photo in silence, his jaw tightening. "This is what Emily meant when she said she had proof," Miss Marple said. "She found it here. Probably after Mildred left the cottage one day, she must have suspected something. The gardening book, unread, undisturbed for years. But she found it. And when she confronted Mildred, it sealed her fate. But Finch said he acted under pressure. He did. But not from Mildred. Not entirely. He owed someone, remember? And I think it was Henry." Cray blinked. "But he's dead." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice softer now. "But some debts live beyond the grave." She explained her theory slowly. Finch had worked for the Carters before. The fire. An odd job man, often paid in cash, someone who saw more than people realized. He likely knew about Henry's first marriage to Clara's mother. He may have even known about the second will, the one Mildred struck through after Henry died in the suspicious fire. But instead of raising an alarm, Finch stayed quiet. Perhaps Henry had helped him once, or perhaps he was promised something: land, work, protection. Either way, when Emily came back and started asking questions, he panicked. When she found the photo, the pattern was complete. Someone told him to watch her. When she started poking into old boxes and church records, they saw the risk, Miss Marple said. But they couldn't act directly, not until she pushed too far. And when she did, they used Finch, not to kill, but to mislead. To hide the first letter, to plant the scarf, to tamper with the scene before the body was found. Cray exhaled slowly. "So, who killed her?" Miss Marple looked toward the window, the sky now grey with oncoming drizzle. "I believe it was someone who had the most to lose if Clara returned and claimed what was hers. Someone who knew Henry's real wishes would destroy the image they had built." Cray was already standing. "Mildred," she confessed, Miss Marple said. "But only to silence, not to the act." "Then who?" Miss Marple's gaze did not shift. "Mrs. Wetherill." Cray blinked. She knew everything. She never left this village, never gave up watching. She saw her daughter return, attach herself to Emily and stir the pot. She knew what Henry did to her daughter, and to her. She blamed the Carters, every one of them. But it wasn't vengeance that drove her. It was control. Clara was her only child. She couldn't let her disappear into scandal again. She couldn't lose her twice. So she killed Emily to save Clara from being dragged into the past. She convinced herself it was for Clara's protection, that Clara couldn't handle another rejection. Emily, she believed, would leave her again, expose her again, so she removed her. Cray's voice was low. "And Finch?" She reminded him what Henry owed him. She leaned on that loyalty. She told him he had a duty. And, when the time came, he obeyed. Cray left the room without a word and returned 10 minutes later with the arrest warrant. Mrs. Wetherill, though already held, had said little since her initial interview. But when the photo was placed before her, the wedding, the inscription, she stared at it for a long time, then finally spoke. "She was going to tear my daughter apart. You don't know what Clara was like after Henry left. You don't know what she lost. I couldn't let her fall into it again." Cray said nothing as he turned away. Miss Marple remained at the table watching her. "The truth," she said gently, "isn't what ruins people. The lies are." That evening, rain pattered gently against the windows of the vicarage. Miss Marple sat once more with her knitting, the threads in her hand finally untangled, and, though the house was quiet, she felt a strange peace settle in. The truth, though heavy, had surfaced. The pattern had always been there, sewn into the silence, hidden in the books, spoken in the pauses between words. All it needed was someone to notice where the dust hadn't settled. The rain eased into a steady rhythm by morning, a quiet tapping. That seemed almost respectful after the storm of revelations the night before. The village of Lower Fell, still blinking in the aftermath, remained subdued. News of Mrs. Wetherell's arrest had not yet reached many ears, though whispers had already begun to form along fences and between market stalls. Inspector Cray spent the morning reviewing statements and evidence with growing clarity. Everything was aligning. The scarf, the missing letter, the second will, the hidden photograph. But for all the facts and forged papers, the question that had haunted the case from the beginning still lingered unresolved. Why? Miss Marple, never one to rest, while an answer remained unspoken, arrived at the station just before noon, with her coat damp and her handbag tucked beneath her arm. She asked to see Mrs. Wetherell, not to accuse her, not to argue, but to listen. Cray agreed, albeit reluctantly, and they led her down to the holding cell, where the older woman sat on the narrow bench, hands folded, her back straight, her gaze steady. She didn't flinch when Miss Marple entered. "You've come to see the monster," she said quietly. "I've come to understand her," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Wetherell's lips curved, not into a smile, but into a bitter tilt of something that might once have been pride. "They think I killed her for Clara, out of shame or fear, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked, not with judgment, but genuine curiosity. Mrs. Wetherell looked down at her hands. Everyone always thought Henry ruined Clara, but it wasn't just him, it was all of them. Mildred, the Carter name, the parish that whispered, behind closed doors. Clara left this village because they made it impossible for her to stay. But when she came back and fell in with Emily, I saw it happening again. The same story, beginning all over. "She loved Emily," Miss Marple said gently. "She clung to Emily," the woman replied, voice sharp. "She saw something in that girl she thought would fix what had happened before. But Emily wasn't strong enough. She was reckless. She didn't care who saw them. She was going to destroy Clara with good intentions." Miss Marple was silent. "I watched them," Mrs. Wetherell said. "Listened to them from the garden. Emily talked about going public, about letters, documents, family records. She said the village needed to hear the truth." Her voice tightened. "But truth doesn't fix the past. It just burns what's left of it." Miss Marple sat on the wooden stool across from her. "So you killed her to protect Clara's reputation?" Mrs. Wetherell finally looked at her, and in her eyes was not grief or fear, but something rawer. "I killed her because she was going to leave. I saw it, the way she pulled away. She had all these grand ideas about London, about making Clara come with her. But she would have gone without her if Clara hesitated. And Clara, she would have crumbled again, been left behind again." The air in the room shifted. "You didn't do it to protect Clara," Miss Marple said, voice barely above a whisper. "You did it because you couldn't bear to lose her. Not to Emily. Not again." Mrs. Wetherell didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. Miss Marple continued, "You spent your life binding your daughter to your side, by guilt, by silence, by the weight of what she endured. And then Emily came, and you saw her reaching for something different, a future that didn't include your grief, and you were afraid, not of scandal, not of inheritance, but of being left alone." Mrs. Wetherell's breath caught, the slightest tremble in her shoulders betraying what her expression refused to show. "You think you understand, but you don't. You've never buried a daughter while she's still breathing." "I've seen what loneliness does," Miss Marple said gently. "And I've seen how it turns into something else when left unspoken. You wanted Clara to need you more than anyone. And when Emily made her feel whole without you, you acted not from hate, but from possession." There was a long silence. Then Mrs. Wetherell's voice came, cracked and low. "I didn't mean to. Not that night. I just wanted to talk to her. to warn her. But she laughed, said Clara wasn't mine to keep, and in that moment, she trailed off. She became another thief, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Wetherill looked at her then. The defiance faded. She was already walking away in her mind. I saw it in her eyes, and all I could think was, not again. I reached for the scarf. I don't even remember knotting it, just the stillness after. Miss Marple rose slowly. That's the tragedy, you see. Not just what you did, but that you thought you were saving love by smothering it. Later, as Miss Marple walked out into the cool afternoon, Cray met her beneath the eaves of the station. So that's it then? It was never about Emily's choices, she replied. It was about Clara's. She'll live with this forever. They both will, he nodded, rubbing his temple. Strange thing. We chased documents and photographs, wills and poison. But in the end, it came down to fear, not greed. No, Miss Marple said. It was a different kind of hunger, the kind that disguises itself as love. And as she walked back to the vicarage, the wind carried the faint scent of lilac across the road. The storm had passed. The truth had risen, not loud, not clean, but full. And in the quiet that followed, something like healing had room to begin. The village had begun to settle again, the tension loosening its grip in the way it always did after a reckoning. Yet something in Miss Marple remained alert, still watching, still listening. Though Mrs. Wetherill had confessed, though her motive had emerged, raw and complex, one piece of the puzzle still floated untethered: the disappearance of the second letter from police evidence. It had reappeared later, yes, found behind the book as if placed there anew, but the timeline around it remained murky. That single act, the theft of Emily's warning, had nearly undone the entire investigation. And Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty that years of observation bring, that the one responsible had not been Mrs. Wetherill. She had spent the morning revisiting conversations in her head, watching again the performances so many had given. Clara Wetherill's silence since her mother's arrest had been understood as grief. But grief did not look like calculation, and grief did not explain why she had insisted from the very beginning that she never received Emily's letter, while never asking who might have intercepted it. Miss Marple found Clara that afternoon in the garden behind the vicarage, kneeling in the soil with her sleeves rolled and her expression fixed. She was pulling weeds with an intensity that was neither productive nor comforting, and Miss Marple stood quietly until Clara noticed her. "You should rest," the old woman said gently. "I can't sit still," Clara replied, not looking up. "If I do, I'll think." Miss Marple walked closer, hands folded at her waist. "You never asked me how I found the second letter." Clara's hands stopped moving. "You never asked if it had been read, if someone had tampered with it. Most people would have. Most people who had waited for a letter they never received." Clara finally turned her face. Her eyes were red, not from crying, but from exhaustion. Miss Marple sat on the garden bench nearby. "When Emily told you she had something to show you, proof you were afraid, not just of what it would reveal, but that she would control the story." Clara stood now, her voice sharp. "You think I betrayed her?" "I think," Miss Marple said calmly, "that when she started looking into the past, you were with her. At first you helped. You wanted the truth as badly as she did, but then you realized the truth didn't make you strong, it made you exposed. And that frightened you more than anything." Clara stepped back. "My mother killed her." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but the stage was set long before your mother acted. Someone had to remove the letter. Someone had to delay its discovery. Someone who had access to Emily's room to the station. Someone the police would never suspect. You can't prove I took it." "No," Miss Marple said. But you just did. Clara's jaw tensed. Miss Marple continued gently now. You loved her. I believe that. But you also feared her. Because she was fearless. And if she had lived, she would have pulled you into the light with her. Whether you wanted to go or not. You weren't ready. So when the moment came to choose, you hid the letter. You let things fall as they may. And then, when it all began to unravel, you returned it just in time. Just enough to help. Just enough to be a victim again. Clara's silence was brittle. She looked down at her soil-caked fingers, then out at the hedgerow where the sun was beginning to press through the branches. I didn't plan for her to die, she said, her voice low. I only needed time. I needed her to wait, to stop. You knew your mother would do anything for you. I never asked her to, Clara whispered. She saw me breaking and she acted. That's what she does. She breaks things so I don't have to. Miss Marple stood, walking slowly to Clara's side. But you do have to. You have to live with this now. All of it. Not just the guilt, but the silence that let it happen. Clara's shoulders dropped. Will they arrest me? That's not for me to decide, Miss Marple said. But if you tell the truth, you'll stop running from the one thing Emily never feared, being seen as she truly was. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to the police station. Inspector Cray met her at the front steps, arms crossed, face unreadable. She told him everything, Clara's words, the timeline, her actions. He said nothing at first. Then he let out a long breath. No law against cowardice, he said. But it explains the mess. She'll carry it, Miss Marple replied. That's its own weight. I suppose that leaves us with one last statement to file. But there was one more thread still unwoven. Miss Marple asked Cray to delay for an hour. Alone, she returned once more to the Carter cottage, empty now, cold, stripped of its former order. She moved to the sitting room and reached once again for the silent guest, running her fingers along the edge of the page where the letter had been hidden. She didn't expect to find anything more, but sometimes the weight of resolution rests best in repetition. Except this time, there was something tucked beneath the book itself, beneath the shelf lining. A final note in Emily's hand. If anyone finds this and I've gone, know that I trusted too easily. Not because I was foolish, but because I believed the people I loved were better than their fear. Miss Marple stood for a long time, reading those lines over and over. Not a message of blame, not a cry for justice, but a statement of faith. And she understood then, in the deepest way, why Emily had been killed. Not for what she knew, not even for what she might say, but because she had the courage to forgive before anyone was ready to be forgiven. That night, Miss Marple placed the letter in Inspector Cray's hands, and with it the story ended, not with vengeance nor with peace, but with the quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest danger is not what people hide. It's what they can't accept being loved in, spite of. The final letter Emily had written, the one tucked beneath the shelf, had closed the case in most eyes. Her words bore no accusation, no bitterness, only a kind of exhausted grace that once spoken aloud at the inquest seemed to hush even the most persistent whispers. The village began to move forward, its rhythm cautious, but mending. Clara Wetherill, having given a full statement, was released without charge. Her role in withholding the letter had been significant, but Cray had decided that the weight of her silence would outlast any sentence the law could deliver. Mrs. Wetherill remained in custody, awaiting trial, her health deteriorating rapidly, under the pressure of solitude and consequence. Miss Marple, though satisfied that justice had been served in some form, continued to turn the matter over in her mind like an old coin. She had seen how truth, once cracked open, rarely settled, without stirring something deeper. Emily had named no enemy in her letters, but that final note, the one discovered beneath the bookshelf, lingered with her. I trusted too easily, not because I was foolish, but because I believed the people I loved were better than their fear. There was forgiveness in those words, yes, but also a subtle sting, a suggestion that someone very close to Emily had failed her in a way far more profound than betrayal. It was a week later, on a crisp Sunday morning, that Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to the Carter cottage, now scheduled to be sold by the parish as part of the estate closure. Cray had offered her the chance to walk through before it was cleared. The house was still, cleared of all personal belongings. Dust lay undisturbed in the corners. The wallpaper looked faded under the light of a cloudy sky. And yet, something called her toward the sitting room one final time. She stood in the center of the room just as she had done before, and closed her eyes. This time she imagined Emily not on the settee, but standing, alive, reading, thinking, waiting. And suddenly, it came back to her, the teacup. Not the one on the tray, but the second one, the one set on the windowsill during the first day of the investigation. Cray had dismissed it as leftover from earlier in the day. Aunt Mildred had claimed no one else visited. Finch had denied being inside the house before the body was found. But Emily had not been alone. Miss Marple turned and scanned the shelf once more. In a small hollow beside the baseboard, where the floor met the rear leg of the sideboard, she noticed a glint of glass. She crouched down, reached in carefully, and pulled out a small bottle, cylindrical, stoppered, empty. It was too small for medicine and unlabeled. She wrapped it in her handkerchief and left at once. At the station, Cray inspected the bottle with narrowed eyes. "We dusted this place top to bottom. That wasn't there." "It was placed later," Miss Marple said, "by someone who thought they were finished." "But they weren't." Cray's brow furrowed. "You think there's someone else still involved?" "I don't think Mrs. Wetherill acted alone," she replied. "Not in the end. The scarf may have been her hand. But the bottle, the poison, the timing, I believe someone else helped cover it. And not for love, but for fear of their own exposure." Cray exhaled. "Then who?" Miss Marple said nothing. She simply returned to her room and waited. That night, as the village darkened and lamps glowed behind drawn curtains, she penned 3 quiet invitations, hand-delivered to Inspector Cray, Clara Wetherill, and Elsie, the maid. She asked them to join her the following evening at the Carter cottage, one last time, before the keys were handed over to the council. The request was phrased gently, almost like a farewell. When they gathered, the sitting room was lit by a single oil lamp and the faint scent of beeswax from the polished floor. Miss Marple stood by the mantel, the bottle on the table before her. "I wanted to speak with you all," she began, "not to unearth further pain, but to close something properly. Emily's death was not only a matter of inheritance or jealousy. It was a story layered with choices, with shifting allegiances. And someone here, someone present, played a role they thought would stay hidden." Clara's face went still, but not with fear. Elsie looked puzzled, and Cray's hand shifted slightly, resting beside his notebook. Miss Marple lifted the bottle. This was not part of the original scene. It was placed there recently, and I believe it held the compound that transferred to the scarf, the trace of cyanide that puzzled us all. But what's curious is not just the chemical, it's the absence of fingerprints, wiped clean, and that tells me this person wasn't panicking. They were careful, skilled. She turned to Elsie. "May I ask, did you ever touch Emily's tea?" "That day," Elsie looked flustered. I set the tray, but I didn't pour, I swear it." "I believe you," Miss Marple said. "You're not the one I'm concerned with." Her eyes moved to Cray. For the first time, the room felt colder. You said you checked the bottle, that you found no label, no print. But I never gave it to you. I never removed the handkerchief. Cray's jaw clenched. I wondered why the evidence room failed to turn up the missing letter. You blamed poor security. Then Finch was watched, but never charged. And now this bottle appears far too easily, at a time when no one but the inspector, and I knew the cottage would be visited again. There was silence. You tampered with the first letter, didn't you? She said quietly. You took it, thinking it would stop the case from expanding. You wanted it neat, closed, and when Emily's other note appeared, you realized the mistake. But it was too late, so you planted this, hoping it would draw suspicion back to Finch, tie off the story cleanly. No more loose ends. Cray didn't deny it. He simply straightened and said, You're accusing a senior officer without hard proof. I'm not accusing you of murder, Miss Marple replied. I'm accusing you of obstruction and cowardice. You didn't act out of conspiracy. You acted because you were afraid the truth would touch too many pillars of this village. The Carter name, the Wetherill estate, the old entitlements. You thought if you could keep it small, it would remain safe. Clara turned toward him slowly. You let them tear her memory apart. Cray's voice was flat. I was trying to protect the town. You were protecting history, Miss Marple said. The same history Emily wanted to outgrow. You didn't kill her, but you buried her. Voice for your convenience. Cray stepped back, then turned toward the door. But outside, a second constable waited, one Miss Marple had sent word to privately earlier that day. Cray paused, then nodded. He didn't resist. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Clara looked at Miss Marple. So that's the end? No, she said gently. It's the beginning. Now you can tell the whole story. And for the first time in weeks, the silence that followed did not feel heavy. It felt earned. The door to the Carter cottage closed quietly behind Inspector Cray as the constable led him away, and in the hush that followed, the stillness felt different. Not oppressive, not fragile, but charged with the gravity of what had finally been seen. Clara stood by the window, arms crossed tightly over herself, staring at the trees swaying gently in the breeze, as if their movement might distract her from the last hour. Elsie remained seated, hands clutched in her lap, her eyes flicking between Miss Marple and the darkened hallway, as if afraid some new horror might yet emerge. But Miss Marple remained standing near the mantel, her frame upright but never harsh, her voice even and quiet as she turned back to the room. There are always clues, she said, not to boast, but to settle the air. But we overlook them when we want something to be simple, neat, finished. Clara finally turned, her voice low. You knew he was part of it. I suspected he wasn't just clumsy with the evidence, Miss Marple said. He wanted resolution, but only one, that preserved the structure he believed in. It wasn't about protecting a person. It was about protecting the story. But Emily never cared about that, Clara whispered. No, Miss Marple said softly. Emily believed truth was not something you could fold to fit the walls of an old room. She saw how the past had been rewritten in this village again and again to keep the same names safe. Cray knew that too. And once he saw how far Emily was willing to go, he realized he could either let the truth out or guide it somewhere quieter. Elsie's voice, timid but steady, cut in. I always wondered why he was so quick to dismiss the first scarf. He told me it was irrelevant, just a detail. I thought he was being efficient. But he knew, didn't he? Miss Marple nodded. He knew it would lead somewhere inconvenient. Clara moved across the room now, slowly, the way someone returns, to a place not sure whether it's safe. But why would he take the risk? He wasn't part of the murder. If anything had gone wrong, he didn't believe it would, Miss Marple said. He thought he was the most careful one in the room. That's always the way with men like him, calculated, practiced, convinced they're the only ones capable of holding chaos at bay. And because his hands weren't stained with the act itself, he told himself it was a kind of civic duty to limit damage, preserve peace. But he destroyed peace, Clara said almost to herself. He delayed justice, Miss Marple corrected gently. He didn't prevent it. He never understood that truth has a way of surviving in the smallest things. A book spine out of place, a note tucked behind a board, a teacup left on the wrong shelf. All he did was stall its arrival. There was a long pause then. Clara sat slowly, her shoulders hunched forward. And now? Now, Miss Marple said, the court will decide the rest. Mrs. Wetherell's trial will go forward. Cray's part will come to light in due time. Finch will remain a footnote, misguided, complicit, but not malevolent. And Emily? She let the name rest on the air. Emily will be known not just as a victim, but as someone who saw through the silence. Elsie's eyes brimmed, but she blinked quickly and nodded. She was kind to me, always. She was. Brave, Clara added. Braver than I ever was. Miss Marple didn't reply at first. Then she stepped closer to Clara and knelt beside her, not condescendingly, but as one woman speaking to another across a long, hard line. You're not alone in that, my dear. Many people failed to be brave in this story, but you've still time to choose what you do next. Clara looked at her, uncertain. And what would you do? Miss Marple gave a faint smile. I'd speak plainly. I'd tell the truth, all of it. Not just what happened that night, but what happened before. What your mother kept from you. What the village chose to forget. Because that's the only way people like Emily ever truly win, when we tell the story in full. Later that week, Clara returned to the church and requested the records office be opened. With the vicar's blessing, she reviewed the archives herself. Birth records, marriage entries, property disputes. She asked that the original version of her parents' marriage be re-acknowledged in the public ledger, her name reinstated under its rightful lineage. She stood in the churchyard beside Emily's headstone, a modest but lovingly placed marker now surrounded with late-blooming primrose, and she left a copy of the final letter tucked in a sealed envelope beneath a stone. As for Inspector Cray, he was quietly removed from duty pending investigation. His public explanation cited exhaustion, the strain of a complicated case. No formal charges were filed. He had not murdered after all. But his reputation, once ironclad, now bore a quiet crack no one pretended not to see. Miss Marple received no accolades, no ceremonies. That wasn't her way. But she did receive a letter, weeks later, handwritten by Clara, thanking her for not letting the story end where others tried to bury it. She read it with care, folded it neatly, and placed it in a box beside a collection of pressed flowers and small handkerchiefs. One evening, as the first frost set in, the vicar's wife remarked over tea that it was good, wasn't it, that everything had come together in the end? Miss Marple looked over her cup and replied, It didn't come together. It fell apart just enough for us to finally see what was hidden inside. Then she returned to her knitting, quiet, alert, and, just as always, one stitch ahead of the unraveling threads around her. It was on one of the last warm days before winter fully arrived that Miss Marple walked once more past the Carter cottage. The windows were shuttered now, the gate padlocked, and ivy had begun reclaiming the edges of the stone wall. The council had delayed its sale following the investigation. Paperwork and inheritance questions still swirled. But for all intents and purposes, the case was closed. The village had exhaled. The tension that had once curled in door frames and whispered at the grocer's counter had dispersed into something like calm. Miss Marple, however, didn't walk by to admire the silence. Her eyes lingered on the front step, on the cracked tile, near the door, and on the rusted iron bell that had once rung when visitors arrived. Something about it still tugged at her, faint but persistent, like a melody remembered in fragments. She had come here thinking only to reflect, to close her thoughts in peace. But as she stepped toward the garden's edge, something shifted in her footing, a shallow give beneath her shoe. She bent down and brushed away the loose gravel, revealing an uneven stone. When she lifted it, she found a weathered envelope, protected by waxed cloth, its corners curled but intact. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's. The name on the front read not Clara or Aunt Mildred, but M.F. Miss Marple turned it over slowly. She did not open it there. Instead, she walked the narrow lane back to the vicarage with careful, steady steps, as though the envelope itself might crumble under the weight of haste. In her room, with a cup of black tea gone lukewarm beside her, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. To the one who always sees through quiet things. If you're reading this, something's gone wrong. Not just with me, but with everything I tried to set right. I've tried to be careful, but I've also been followed. Watched, I think. More than once I've seen someone at the gate and assumed it was Mr. Finch or the neighbour's boy. But then things started moving in the house. A drawer left open. A book closed when I knew I'd marked it. I thought I was being paranoid, but I'm not sure anymore. If I disappear, or worse, know that it may not just be Aunt Mildred or Clara's past or even that scarf. There's someone else who's been here longer than any of us, someone who never left, and they know how to stay invisible. I've found scraps, notes, receipts, newspaper clippings hidden behind cupboard panels. I don't know what they mean yet, but someone's been collecting secrets for years. If you find this, maybe you'll know where to look next. Emily Miss Marple set the letter down with hands that didn't tremble. She stared at it, her expression unreadable, then reached for her notebook. Not to write, but to turn back to an earlier page, long forgotten, one dated only a few days before Emily's death. There, she had scribbled a name, Mrs. Linton, the old widow who once occupied the gardener's cottage behind the Carter property, thought to have moved to Bournemouth 5 years earlier. Miss Marple had asked after her early in the investigation, when trying to track ownership of the land, but had found no reply. It hadn't mattered then. It matters now. She rose, wrapped herself in her shawl, and stepped out into the evening air. The gardener's cottage had remained unoccupied, or so it had seemed. No lights, no visitors. But now, with Emily's letter in hand, she noticed what she had missed before. The rust on the gate latch had been disturbed. A footprint in the moss by the door, too recent for rain to have blurred it. And the faint scent of wood smoke when there hadn't been any fire. Reported in days, she didn't approach the door, not yet. She turned instead, retraced her steps to the vicarage, and quietly asked the vicar's wife if anyone had seen Mrs. Linton lately. The woman frowned. "I thought she moved, didn't she?" Miss Marple gave a tight smile. "So we believed." Hour later, with a uniformed constable at her side, they knocked on the cottage door. No answer came. They circled the side garden and peered in through the cracked window pane. Inside was dust, yes, but also order. A fresh teacup, a recently moved curtain, a small fire burned low in the grate. It wasn't Mrs. Linton who emerged from the back door minutes later, startled by the lamplight. It was her nephew, Alfred Linton, gaunt, twitchy, known once in the village as peculiar, then long presumed relocated after his aunt's departure. No one had inquired after him. No one had noticed his return. In his possession were dozens of pages. Emily's notes, some with her handwriting, others with his. Ramblings, crossed-out dates, partial family trees. A hidden archive of village, scandals spanning 3 decades, names, affairs, bribes, secrets Emily had stumbled onto when she opened the wrong cupboard and saw a familiar signature on an unfamiliar birth record. She hadn't known what it meant, but Alfred did. He had been watching all along, because knowing things made him important, and Emily had threatened that. She didn't even know it. He hadn't killed her, but he'd frightened her. Moved her. Things. Listened at her door. The poison. Not his. The scarf. He never touched it. But the atmosphere of fear, the sense that danger lingered just out of sight, he had crafted that. In the report filed later, Inspector Cray's name was mentioned. Only once. Mrs. Wetherill remained the primary defendant. Clara Wetherill withdrew from the public entirely, and Alfred Linton was charged not with murder, but with obstruction, stalking, and the theft of private property. When asked why he'd done it, he said, "She was going to undo everything I knew. People trusted me with their mistakes, and she wanted to put them in a book." Miss Marple watched from the steps of the vicarage as the constables led him away. She said nothing. Later, as she folded Emily's letter for the final time and placed it in her bureau, she paused, because even now there was a line she couldn't stop hearing. "There's someone else who's been here longer than any of us. She'd..." Thought Emily had meant Alfred, but what if she hadn't? What if someone else, someone smarter, quieter, even closer, had stayed behind every curtain? The Carter name, the Wetherill name, the village itself, they had all been preserved not just by lies, but by watchers, people who didn't act, but remembered. The mystery, it seemed, had ended, but Miss Marple, gazing out her window toward the dark hill behind the old church, knew better. Some mysteries don't end, they wait.